Josh talked about a lot of stuff like you're hearing like constraints, you know, looking at data, prototyping, and I think all that stuff is amazing. It's awesome. But I'm gonna kind of dive into some like thoughts on responsiveness, thoughts on pixels, thoughts on Retina. So attacking Retina, and I think Retina is really a fascinating topic because Retina is not really a thing that we have to deal with yet. Retina is really just Apple's branding of high definition, high density screens, right? And yet, my mother and my grandmother, they actually know what Retina is. They mention it to me. They don't know what it is, but they mention it. And what's interesting about it is that it's not what actually is happening to us right now that we have to build for Retina. It's what it's going to do to the way that we design for everything else. And that's what I think is really interesting in driving the design process throughout devices. So you hear about mobile first. Hotel Tonight, we're mobile only. And I think that kind of drives a lot from the mobile first methodology. And I'm going to focus mostly on a little bit of technique, a little bit of specifics, and kind of a lot of overall approach to the way that Retina works and the way that it can drive your design process in a really good direction. So the first thing that's really, really interesting about Retina is that when you're scaling up or you're scaling down, you're actually dealing with the same design. And a lot of designers are kind of getting into this field now. And you maybe have heard the Retina War or anything like that, where people are kind of talking about, oh, well, we're going to abandon everybody that uses a non-Retina device because now we have MacBooks that have awesome screens. And you're hearing a lot about like, oh, everything looks awful on non-Retina screens. And the fact of the matter is the millions and millions of devices out there are non-Retina. And basically, what's going on with it is that we have these kind of beautiful pixels, if you will, that are happening. And we basically have to take into account what's happening on the other devices. But it isn't really that simple because a lot of people will just build their kind of beautiful Retina design. They'll be like, oh, this looks gorgeous, looks amazing. And then they'll run it through a tool. They won't even deliver it. Some of the iOS kits allow you to just kind of ignore it, and it'll try to build it. And the problem is that when you ignore what's behind you, you get stuff that's like not actually designed. And a lot of what I'm looking at with Retina, and what we all should be looking at, is what does Retina do to our process? So for me, it's about details. And I think that goes back into user experience. It goes back into how an app is built. Everything is about the way that you function in terms of your details. Like at the end of the day, detail is actually about simplicity. And the beautiful thing about Retina is that when you start building with Retina and you have to take into account all the other different things that are happening, it makes you focus on the details because you're going to call it out for it if you didn't do it right. So just to kind of jump into a quick technique, kind of learning if you didn't know about. So when you actually build a Retina design, you're building it at twice the pixel size of another screen. It's higher density. It's 321 pixels per inch, 163 on a regular size device. So a lot of designers like to do this. They just build delicious like smart object vector graphics, and then they just go, oh, I'm going to drop in Photoshop, 50% it. Let's go. But what ends up happening is you have to deal with interpolation. And that's where what's actually happening with all your other devices is everyone's kind of getting like secondhand experiences. Like, no one likes leftovers. Like, why would you treat 80% of your customers like with leftovers instead of the beautiful meal? So what I'm going to talk about mainly is kind of a little bit of the technique. When you build in Retina, you have to build in vector. And personally, I actually have never built that into my process. So it's kind of been new over the past few years. A lot of designers kind of get like, comfortable in pixel perfect, like really focusing on that level of detail in painting. And what's really kind of interesting with Retina is it forces you to say, okay, I'm working with vectors, but I don't have the kind of the backup plan, if you will, of an actual vector format. Vectors have to become pixels, right? So when we're building in Retina, you have to actually look at your pixel grid, which is like kind of ironic because you're building everything in vector. So we're talking about like straight lines. We're talking about like round corners that are kind of like curved shapes and stuff like that. And the way that I've seen it done is I've seen a ton of arguments online and from big designers, oh, build it big first, then scale it down. Or no, we got to build it small, then scale it up. And there's a lot of problems with artifacting. There's a lot of problems with kind of getting messy. And the fact of the matter is, it actually works both ways if you build in vector. So starting with vector, you can start large, you can start small. And there's like kind of pros and cons, just to kind of mention a couple of those. At Hotels Tonight, we build in Retina, and then we scale down. But what's really nice is we can have Photoshop actions and stuff like that where we can pop back and forth. So just to kind of give you a couple little tidbits that I think are really nice, is you actually have to get used to building with Photoshop shapes. This is kind of an interesting thing, is going back to the pixel grid, is interestingly enough, circles don't snap to a grid, but a super rounded rectangle will. Those kind of things can get you in like a lot of trouble or a lot of help depending on the way you build it. If I build something just kind of eyeballing on a grid, it looks beautiful, but it's not snapped to the grid and it's not a power of 2, what ends up happening is Photoshop will create a half pixel, or it'll basically kind of try to figure out what it's supposed to do. So that's where things like blending options and smart objects become awesome, because like when you're working on an app or something like that, not everything can be vector in terms of visually. Oh, I want to make a texture, I want to do a nice drop shadow. So the first thing, your kind of first line of defense is to be able to say, okay, I want to use smart objects, I want to use blending options. These things are designed to scale and interpolate with pixels. So is it time consuming? Yeah. And there are tools like these that are actually like pretty decent, but they basically are kind of at, I think, what is the core kind of fundamental problem with approaching Retina as this new beautiful thing that's going to leave the world behind. Hotel Tonight, we're all about simple. It's actually one of those things that we look at like everything. Like for instance, we're pretty proud of the fact that our logo can fit into 6 pixels perfectly. This is pretty difficult to do, and it's pretty easy to scale up though. And the point being is that these things throw like non-Retina under the bus like it's just something you got to do. But in reality, that's most of our audience, and that's most of the detail. And at the end of the day, it forces you to keep it more simple, because people can see all of your mistakes now. People can see everything that goes on. And of course, when you scale up and down, you're going in between Retina, you're going back and forth, you're going to run into a lot of these problems if you don't start moving toward techniques that kind of focus on the specific, simple details. And like, just to kind of close and kind of go back to the idea of prototyping and the idea of what does Retina really do for our process. So at Hotel Tonight, we do a lot of prototyping on the device. As Josh said, I agree. Designers should code, whatever it is. We use HTML5 prototypes. When we have to scroll, we have to check button movements. And I think also Dropbox is a fantastic tool. Make sure you use it with Wi-Fi, though, because otherwise you're going to get artifacting. You're not going to be able to look at it. But the point when I'm making is device testing is that when you're looking at a device, it tells you a lot about the difference between what your screen says and what your actual customer is going to be using. I even tell people, put your phone under sunlight, look at it in the dark. But always, always, always move back and forth between the vector that you're looking at, that smaller size, and the actual device, because all those things tie together so particularly because of the detail. So basically, I just want to leave you with this thought, is that start with vector, like absolutely focus on detail and simplicity, and just remember that Retina is about the customers that are behind us. They're not about the new beautiful devices.